As we indicated earlier in the course, mandatory compliance with the code became a condition of association membership in 1924, and it became the responsibility of local boards throughout the country to enforce the code through a hearing process. The National Association of Realtors promulgates administrative procedures that local boards or associations use to enforce the code, and these procedures are found in the Code of Ethics and Arbitration Manual, published by the National Association on an annual basis. Just as the Code of Ethics is constantly scrutinized and modified to maintain its relevance to the profession, so are the procedures used to enforce the code. The primary reason for such scrutiny is to ensure that the procedures utilized provide due process to all parties involved in the enforcement process. The concept of due process is very simple, but vitally important. To put it simply, every party involved in the enforcement process has the right to be treated fairly and impartially. Some of the basic requirements of due process include the right of a respondent to know what the charges are, the right to have adequate notice in order to prepare for the hearing, the right to call witnesses and present evidence and testimony, the right to legal representation, and, perhaps most importantly, the right to impartial hearing tribunals. Earlier I mentioned that we must always recognize that real estate is a competitive profession, and we can't allow the code to inhibit fair and ethical competition. For example, the code cannot be used to prohibit lawful business practices. Let's say a local realtor opens a new office with a business model that includes offering discounted, flat fees to consumers for brokerage services. The realtor advertises his services and the corresponding fees in the local newspaper. A complaint is filed against the realtor, alleging that such advertising violates Article 12. During the ensuing hearing, the realtor is able to demonstrate that his advertising is an accurate and truthful representation of the services and prices that he offers. However, the panel finds against him because the panel members are concerned about the effect his business model will have on their own businesses. This would be a frightening example of how the enforcement of the code can be used for anti-competitive purposes, and it also opens the door for antitrust allegations. The code can never be used to discourage competition. Let's take a look at the complaint process from beginning to end. First, how does a local association process these complaints? Every association usually has a professional standards administrator. One of the requirements of the National Association is that every local board must have on staff, or must have access to, a trained or certified professional standards administrator. This individual handles the day-to-day procedures used to enforce the code. We've already mentioned that local boards conduct two types of hearings: ethics hearings, where the focus is determining whether the respondent realtor violated specific articles of the code, and arbitration hearings, where the focus is on resolving a monetary dispute. These two types of hearings have distinctly different outcomes and must be treated separately. Consequently, you could never have one hearing where the hearing panel would be evaluating whether ethical violations occurred, as well as resolving a monetary dispute. Both in ethics complaints as well as in arbitration requests, the process is initiated with a written filing. The Code of Ethics and Arbitration Manual contains dozens of model forms that local boards use to facilitate the enforcement process. These include complaint forms and arbitration request forms, which realtors and members of the public can use to initiate the complaints process. Once a written complaint is received, the next step involves a review of the written complaint by the board's grievance committee. The grievance committee is a standing committee of the board, composed of a limited number of realtors, usually an odd number, to prevent tie votes. The grievance committee serves a limited but very important role in the process. They conduct the initial review of every complaint to determine whether the matter should go forward to an ethics hearing. The committee must determine whether the complaint is in an acceptable form. For example, is the complaint legible? Does it cite specific articles of the code? Does it cite, as a respondent, a realtor who holds current membership in the board? Other items for the grievance committee's consideration can be found in the Code of Ethics and Arbitration Manual. how do committee members decide what complaints should go forward to a hearing? In making that determination, the members of the committee do not evaluate the veracity of the complaint, nor do they make the determination based upon the perceived strengths and weaknesses of the complaint. Rather, the committee members assume that the facts of the complaint are true, and then determine if those facts would constitute a possible violation of one or more articles of the Code of Ethics. If the answer to that question is yes, the complaint is passed on. If the answer is no, then no hearing is recommended. Applying this standard, there can be instances when the grievance committee determines that some articles are applicable to the facts of the complaint, and other cited articles are not, and consequently dismiss those articles from the complaint. There can also be times when the committee, based upon their review, determines that there are other articles of the Code that are more relevant, based upon the facts of the complaint, and consequently the committee can add articles as well as dismiss them. Anytime the grievance committee dismisses a complaint or dismisses articles from the complainant may appeal the dismissal to the board of directors of the association. Now, let's take a look at how the grievance committee evaluates arbitration requests. First, let's review the main portion of Article 17 again.
In the event of contractual disputes or specific non-contractual disputes as defined in Standard of Practice 17-4 between realtors, principals, associated with different firms arising out of their relationship as realtors, the realtors shall submit the dispute to arbitration in accordance with the regulations of their board or boards rather than litigate the matter.
So first, the committee must determine whether the dispute is contractual in nature, as contemplated by Article 17. Note that the article specifically mentions disputes between realtor principals. Even if the committee determines that an arbitration request is subject to an arbitration hearing, as per Article 17, it may be subject to either mandatory or voluntary participation by the parties to the dispute. The Code of Ethics and Arbitration Manual goes into greater detail about those types of disputes which are subject to mandatory participation in the arbitration process, as opposed to disputes which are subject to voluntary participation. It's up to the grievance committee to determine whether the arbitration request is subject to mandatory or voluntary participation. The determining factors for this decision are who the parties are to the dispute.